Should we or shouldn't we lean into and address tensions and conflicts in our lives? It's quite a conundrum. Speaking for myself, whether I'm fully aware of it at the conscious level or not, I know that when tensions and conflict arise between me and another person, this whole risk and reward thing starts playing out. Will this be a good idea or will it be a bad idea? Should I just let this tension and conflict lie? And I know that when I'm in conflict with someone, I get this icky tightness in my stomach, more so when I'm, with someone that I'm close to, but also with people at work. And when it happens, I don't breathe smoothly. My breath comes in, it goes out in this sort of shuddered way. It's hard to describe, really, but it's just about the worst feeling in the world. The very idea of leaning into and dealing with conflict with another person just seems like the very last thing you want to do. Most of us would very naturally prefer to keep things positive. Sometimes we avoid conflict not to hurt others. Sometimes we don't speak our truths because we're tired of arguing the same things and never getting anywhere. Maybe we don't say what needs to be said to avoid adding to the pressure that's already there. Or when we've been in conflict, it's been in a toxic way, and rather than serving our relationship, it damages it further. So, of course, a very big part of me is saying no. Don't go there. Definitely not going to lean into this tension and conflict. At the same time, I know that I actually crave connection, understanding, affection, belonging. These are things that, depending on what expert you're talking to, are fundamental needs of every human on the planet. Yet one of my responses to being in conflict with someone is to turn away from them, to shut down, to sort of be my own little island. And when I do that, while there might be some sort of temporary relief, I guess, I still don't like it. It eats away at me over time. I'm not getting my needs met, right? So when I turn away from others, I'm not getting my needs met. And with COVID-19 in the picture, it seems like we need more connection, more understanding, more compassion from the people around us. So another part of me is saying, I shouldn't let this conflict go unattended. I definitely should lean into it and I should address it. I also know that I should do that because I know the conflict doesn't just go away. If I try to avoid it, if I push it under the rug, it doesn't go away. It actually, the longer we go without attending to the rising tensions and conflict, the farther we tend to move from each other. We become more polarized. We become more rigid in our positions. We become stuck, right? There's always going to be differences of opinion. There's nothing new there. And they're okay until one person says, especially if they say so strongly, A is right, B is wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. In other words, we can have a discussion about anything, even contentious topics. But the moment one person's statement insinuates that they are right and the other's view is wrong, that's when conflict emerges, right? But I know that conflict isn't really a bad thing. It gets a bad rap, but the problem isn't conflict, it's how conflict occurs. Conflict is the key to growth, right? There's no growth, there's no development. If there's no change, there's no differences, there's a little tension, at least a little conflict. So I also know that working well with conflicts can help us become, more creative, better decision makers. All that's possible when we learn how to work well with differences in conflict. And this view of conflict just gives us more agency. And I prefer more agency where I can get it. So yes, I want us all to lean in to the tensions and the conflicts in our lives, at least more than we're currently doing. And I want us to learn how to do so more skillfully. In my previous webinars in this series, turning tensions and conflict into growth and creative engagement, and the second one, making decisions that bring others along, I talked quite a lot about the roots of conflict, and I presented a reframing of the idea of conflict. And much, not all of what I'll be covering in this webinar will build on what I introduced in those two recent talks. It's not critical that you caught these to make sense of this one, but you might find it useful to go back and listen to them. You can find them on YouTube. Most of the content of this talk is drawn from the work of Arnold Mandel and from the Lewis method of deep democracy. Deep democracy is a facilitation approach, methodology, oriented toward differences and an appreciation of differences in diversity. And it was first developed in post-apartheid South Africa during a time where there was quite a lot of conflict. It's since spread around the world, over 20 countries, and used in all kinds of contexts. And if you actually registered for this talk, I will send you a follow-up email with some more information and resources. Again, this talk is titled Resolving Tensions and Conflict Between Two People. Okay. And note that my intent is not to disparage or make any meaningful comparisons with other conflict resolution or dispute resolution methodologies, only to present these methodologies and the sort of theories behind them as best I can in a short amount of time. But before I describe the specific methodologies, let's imagine a couple of hypothetical conversations. In both cases, the person has reached a point where, they need to do something, they need to say something. And let's say in this case, it's between a person and a colleague, and they start the conversation like they're using their most savvy communication skills, and they're kind of trying some nonviolent communication techniques at the beginning, and they say something like, I observed that in the last few months, you've been late in getting in your project information entered into the shared, workflow tool thing. And I know that I can't get my monthly reports done when this happens. And it makes me feel like maybe you just don't respect me as a colleague, or that your work is more important than mine. And then the other colleague says, like, sorry, I'll admit the 2 times I didn't get my data entered quite in time. It was a little bit late a couple times, but the only reason this happened is because you failed to tell me about the contract addendum in time. That sure didn't give me the impression you respect me. And for some reason, the first person's next words, they don't follow the nonviolent communication model as well as they'd intended. They become defensive, and then it sort of goes from there, right? Or it could be with, a spouse, your spouse. It might be something like, hey, we need to talk, honey. I've noticed that you haven't done the things you said you were going to do, having to do with refinancing our house. What am I missing? And your spouse responds by saying, well, I don't know what you've noticed, but I've been working extra hours lately because of what's happening at the office. It's not like I'm being lazy. If you think I'm lazy, just let's get it out there. And then you say, I don't think you're lazy, but I reminded you at least 3 times about the fact that I need your most recent pay stubs in order for me to put the paperwork together. What am I supposed to think? And then your spouse says, what do you think I do all day? I work all day, right? When I get home, I'm tired. I don't always have the energy to sit down and do paperwork. And then in spite of your best impulses, you say something like, yeah, I'm sure watching Stranger Things on Netflix every night is a great way to wind down after a long day at work. And so it goes. In spite of your best efforts to be poised and have equanimity, you fall right back into the old patterns. There's a sense of attack and defense, back and forth, each person, becoming more defensive by the moment. And you end up talking about issues that seem utterly removed from the thing that you brought up in the first place. And it's hard for both people to follow what's going on. Sometimes it feels like each person's letting the other have it for past transgressions. It can often feel like the other person, or maybe both people, are strategizing, right? And they're trying to score the next point rather than listen to each other, right? They're trying to win the argument. It feels like like this heated tennis match, and the rivals are at each other. And if you're in the audience, you can sometimes have a hard time following it. It's a much harder to follow the tennis match, the back and forth that's happening in an argument between 2 individuals than is a tennis match. Of course, I'm sure you'd agree. Now, the deep democracy approach maintains that it's better to have the hard conversation, right? To have the fight or the argument, if you will. It's not necessarily about encouraging people to be nice here. Of course, we want harmony. We prefer that, but this approach is different. There may be a lot of emotionality here, but instead of trying to skate around it, it's about trying to lower the waterline and getting the issue or the issues out there in the open. It's about being specific with each other and saying what needs to be said and doing so with a lot of clarity. And when we do this, we avoid staying only at the surface level, which doesn't get us where we need to be. It allows us to go deeper and faster, and doing so in a good way that can be helpful. Now, we're also avoiding holding back critical information, so that we're saying what needs to be said, so we're not holding back stuff that we would later use in a sort of an attacking or a winning way later. And if we do this well, we learn something about ourselves. There's something new that'll help us grow and develop and be a better person. And we also, we become smarter together. We increase collective awareness, and that's a good thing. So I'm now going to be introducing a methodology that the Lewis method of deep democracy calls the argument. It's also referred to as let's talk. If the issue is cycled, if it's become tense between two people, if there's some level of emotionality to it, if it's highly emotional, in particular, it's more like a conflict resolution, but it doesn't have to, it can work at different scales, right? Along a spectrum of like, we're not agreeing to there's conflict. So how do you do this? While the idea is to have the hard conversation, right? To have the fight or the argument to get things out in the open, right? We don't just want to do it though, in the same old way. The tennis match, the attack and defense, the yeah, but you said thing. We want to do it more thoughtfully, more skillfully. And so there are 4 steps in this. They are gaining agreement to go into the argument, throwing all the arrows. I will explain that metaphor a bit later. Owning the grains of truth and taking the grains of truth back to the original issue. And I'll go through them one at a time. And first, you've got this idea of gaining agreement to go into the argument. Now, first you got to acknowledge, someone has to acknowledge that there's having some issues between you. And depending on what the scenario is, husband and wife, 2 friends, colleagues, we need to set it up. And it's important to overview the steps briefly so that people understand what they're getting into, what they're agreeing to or they're disagreeing to. But let's say you've reached the point where you just need to do or say something. And now you've got to convince another person who probably doesn't know anything about this approach to do it with you. And, hey, we need to talk, right? I'm noticing that we're having some tension and conflict between us. And because this relationship is important to me, I think it would be good to address it. I know a facilitation process that I think could really help. Would you be open to hearing it? That might be a nice way to invite it. And, hopefully the other person says, yeah, I'd be open. And maybe you decide to go there and you're off and running, and that's great. But it can just as easily be the case that the other person is thinking, oh crap, this doesn't sound like a good idea at all. There's a chance this person just isn't ready, willing, and able to be there with you. Could be that it's just new. It's new and they're uncomfortable trying a new thing. One good option is to introduce the methodology when both people are not feeling highly emotional, or at least one person isn't feeling unsafe. So you can pick a topic that isn't conflictual, something you can easily practice with. You can do it when you're not in conflict. You can gain confidence in the process. You say to the person, I'm sick of fighting, I want to resolve this issue. The other person might agree, but you might notice that they're giving you double messages. Maybe it's something in their attitude or their body language. And it could be that it's just the time isn't right to do it. You need to be patient, with the other person at that stage, because, you're not ready at that point to resolve the conflict. Maybe the issue needs to sort of, or the argument needs to cycle a few more times until the other person's ready. It could, however, also be that the other person, thinks that there's a better than likely chance that they'll lose more going into it than not going into it. Maybe they believe they lack power or agency, or they might come from a group that's been historically discriminated against or marginalized. Maybe they've experienced gaslighting in the other previous relationship, or maybe this relationship, or they've experienced psychological trauma? I don't know. I mean, every situation is different, and these judgments are going to need to be made. If there is a high level of emotionality and conflict there, or there are meaningful differences in privilege, rank, or power, at least until the two people have gained some experience with the methodology and they've had a positive experience with it, or positive enough, it's probably going to take like a trained, a qualified third party to facilitate this. And maybe in some cases, one individual might need an advocate. It depends. But not every situation is like that, obviously. So let's say you're actually successful about convincing the other person to go into the conversation with you. And it would go, something like this. The first step is to gain the agreement. The first part of that, and this is a very powerful, essential element of the argument, or let's talk in deep democracy, is gaining agreement on the three premises. These three premises underlie the argument in deep democracy. You sit down. You might say, we're going to talk about, all these issues we're having with each other. We're going to say all the things we haven't been saying about the issue. Before we start, let's agree on some rules to help us feel comfortable and safe with one another. The first one is, no one has a monopoly on the truth. So we're acknowledging here that no one individual in any situation can have a monopoly on reality or the truth. All perceptions are equally valid. There's no right and wrong. Each person's perceptions of reality are equally valid. You could take an object like the office chair I'm sitting on, and you could ask different people to describe it, and some might describe the color, some might describe the weight, the shape, the texture, the appropriateness, whatever that may be. And all of these are descriptions of the chair that are real, right? Chair is all of these things, and no one is right or wrong. But because people are going to describe the item or their reality based on their own preferential perceptual lenses. And that applies to all perceptions. People view their world through their unique perceptual lenses. No right, no wrong. Rather, the perception of the events that occurred differ. And the second one is, we're doing this to stay in a relationship. We're acknowledging that the relationship is important. We tend to shy or, away from the conflict. But again, the longer we do so, the longer we evade the issues, the larger they become, the more rigid we become. They cycle, they repeat themselves. Each time they do so, the energy they hold increases and the tension worsens. And so if we don't resolve the tension, the relationship's eventually, inevitably going to break down. So we need to resolve the tensions as they occur to stay in relationship. And then, a very important part of the deep democracy resolution process is discovering something about ourselves that's going to enable our development, our growth. Wow, I wasn't aware of that little, black D part of myself. Thank you for helping me see it. Therefore, there needs to be at least some willingness for growth, but ideally a real desire for growth. And if both parties can agree these premises, you can go forward. If they can't, you don't. Right? The next one, it has to do with safety rules. This is anything that either party feels is necessary for them to feel safe enough to go into the conflict resolution process. It could be confidentiality. What's said in the room needs to stay in the room. It can, I need to be able to cry if that's what's happening for me. I need to be sure that the other person won't physically be assertive during the process. I need to leave at a certain time. I got to pick up my kids for daycare. I can't go for 3 hours, whatever. One person might say that there needs to be enough time to ensure that the conflict is actually resolved, at least adequately, or no one leaves in the midst of the process when we're right in it. So whatever it is, both parties need to agree to the safety rules before you can move forward. And once you both agree to them, and it feels safe enough, I guess it's worth saying, when I say safe enough, it's not like going into conflict, you're never going to get your feathers ruffled. There's never this perfect safe place. And again, there may be, if there are meaningful differences in privilege or rank or power, if one person or one group has been historically discriminated against, the other isn't, or if they've experienced significant trauma in their lives, whatever that might be, getting to safety is going to be more of a challenge. It's going to be even more important, therefore. So once you've agreed to the three premises, the safety rules, the next step is, like, are you ready to go into the argument? Let's ask the question. Each person has to sort of say yes, unambiguously, before you're ready to do that. And the first step in the next step after you've gotten through gaining agreement is to throw all the arrows. Now this is really interesting. We know that every relationship has its ups and downs. And when things are going well, of course, we want to hold on to that. But when something upsets us, when things aren't going well, we don't tend to talk about it, and we say to ourselves, hey, I'll just forget about it. The problem is we don't really forget about it. We tend to save it up like an arrow that we put in a quiver, which we might pull out later during a fight. And we do this to win the fight. And, please forgive the somewhat violent metaphor. I've tried to find a good substitute for it in the world of sports and elsewhere, but nothing quite gets at what we're trying to convey here. With the argument, it's not about winning or losing. It's important to throw all the arrows, not in a violent way, but the key point is to say everything that needs to be said between you and having to do with the issues you're struggling with together, and you leave nothing in the quiver. Most conversations do this sort of like the tennis match thing, back and forth, attack and defense, and then there's a sense that, like, they're not saying everything, they're holding it back at a later date. And again, there's no defense here. So here, one person says everything they have to say about the issue between them, and the other person just listens. And that's kind of how it works. Once the first person feels like they've said everything they have to say, then the other person gets a chance to do the same. And once that second person has said everything they have to say about the issue or issues they're having with the other person, then the first person gets to go again. Now, maybe something the other person said just triggered a thought for them, or maybe they weren't ready the first round to say a particular thing. They're leaning into the process. It doesn't matter. They just get another opportunity. And of course, after they get another opportunity, then the second person gets the chance to go again. All the arrows are thrown from one side and then the other. And this happens as many times as needed. In my experience, though, both doing this with my wife and facilitating the process with clients, it typically takes around 3 rounds. You find that if more rounds are needed, there's probably a good chance that people aren't being overly polite. They're not saying everything they have to say. There's still stuff below the waterline, right? They're not being direct or clear enough. So we'll be doing ourselves a big favor if we are trying to be direct and clear, if we're not oblique or indirect, if we are not owning our own perspective. So we want to speak from the I, and of course there's a difference between being violent and being mean or highly judgmental, and being specific and clear and direct and honest. Judgment implies that we're right, about the meaning of the action the other person took, or their words, that we have a monopoly on the truth there. We might think about using what we call, the Gottman Institute refers to something as clean talk rather than toxic language. We might try to share our observations and our feelings regarding those observations as per the nonviolent communication approach. You don't want to say things like, you did this and I just can't believe you'd be that horrible. You're a terrible person. Hopefully, I'm getting at, we can be direct, we can be specific, we can speak from the I, and we can avoid being violent, angry, and judgmental, or violent and judgmental. Anger might come out. So once all the arrows have been thrown, it's time to move on to step 3, which is only Granite Truth. And again, the idea here is that each person needs to acknowledge and own at least one piece, one grain of truth from the conversation. For us to truly resolve conflict, we need to first realize that conflict is a normal part of life, that it can be, in fact, healthy, and it can be, in fact, helpful to us. And it's through the listening to the complaints of another person, that the complaints they have about us, that we become aware of the grains of truth about ourselves that we weren't able to see before. And these can be linked to what we know of as the shadow side of ourselves, that part of ourselves that we're not conscious of and might not particularly like about ourselves. You know, it's hard hearing criticism from somebody, and we often become defensive. It's super hard not to, but our defensiveness can make us deaf to the insights that are undoubtedly there in what the other person is saying. And this is one of the reasons issues cycle between people. As a result of the cycling, the issues become exaggerated, they become blown out of all proportion. The person is saying that we're like an axe murderer, but what they really are trying to say is that, you know, they don't feel respected. And, you know, let me say once again that, you know, owning a grain of truth is going to be especially challenging for people that have had, you know, historically been discriminated against, or have been gaslighted or experienced trauma or what have you. But it still is possible. You know, it could be something that either person said. It could be something you said that might spark something in you. It doesn't matter. We're inviting you to become aware of what it was, what struck you. What does it say about me? You know, what is the learning here for me? It's, you know, it's not easy looking at that part that might be unpleasant. So the idea is to metaphorically take out the arrow, gently look at it, acknowledge, and hopefully own it. That's the wisdom. Each person should share at least one thing. And they should do that in the form of an I statement. You know, I realize when I show up late for meetings habitually, it's partly out of the need to not feel like I'm being overly managed or handled. And I can see how this would be confusing and even hurtful to you, you know, whatever it is. Now, before going into step 4, which is taking the grains of truth back to the original issue, I want to share with you a bit about Arnold Mandelas' role theory. Arnold Mandelas, a physicist and a Jungian analyst, and the argument is based on role theory. Now, a key idea here is that conflict can help us grow by allowing us to become more aware of things we weren't aware of, but in particular, to be aware of part of ourselves that we tend to unknowingly project onto another person. So let's say there are 2 people and one person is feeling pretty firm on a particular view, like you did this one thing and it was out of line. Let's call this side A. The other person is seeing something very different and is quite fixated on another view, which is like, you know, actually what happened is you did this. That's the bigger issue. And I've clearly been wrong here. So let's call this side B. So this theory suggests that at least some small part of me agrees with that big blue bee, represented in the image here as a small blue bee under the waterline in my unconscious mind. And that small red C and that little black D here suggests that there may be other things that I also likely feel. In other words, there's more to me than just this big green A that I've become so fixated on. And when I keep my waterline high, when I'm closed to other views or their ideas, when I don't have access to these parts of myself, you know, that's my fuller potential. You know, I tend to hold on tightly to my big green A, and it becomes bigger and more rigid in me. And as I project the part of me that feels a little bit like that blue bee onto the other person, they become more rigid in that view, right? Or that role. And that role becomes more, you know, big in them. It becomes bigger in them. And they do the same to me. So in general, the deep democracy approach is about helping each one of us uncover the little bit of the blue or the red or the black that's in each of us that we deny. And it enables us to recognize that when there's tension through differences of opinion, that the differences of opinion will tend to polarize us. And those polarities will make us more rigid. You know, I think the world is made up of big blue bees. I think the world is made up of big green A's, and that's not a good place to be. So through this methodology, we're able to move beyond what we call role rigidity or energies that become more rigid. And so we're able to move people into acknowledging the other parts of themselves. You know, what we're doing through lowering the waterline is giving ourselves more of ourselves than we had before. You know, we're no longer projecting. And that just creates a better dynamic between two people. So now going back to owning the Granite Truth, and and now we're taking that Granite Truth back to the original issue or issues between us. And so this is where we, like based on this awareness, what decision would I make? Okay, you got this new awareness. So the conflict, particularly if it's in a work situation, it's arisen alongside some issue. So the grains of truth that come out of the conflict can be important keys or some bits of wisdom to add to the issue. They can be operationalized, if you will. In other words, they give us an indication of how behavior in the future needs to be aligned, adapted, changed. Like, so, I'm going to try a lot harder to be on time for our meetings. I realize this has, a lot to do with some of the tensions, and it will help us lower those tensions. And we'll have better meetings and more productive meetings together, as an example. So, with that added wisdom, the issues above the waterline will be more easily resolved. I'm going to briefly introduce a related methodology where two people, or it could be two groups, are looking together at two sides of an issue, and we call this the debate. And we do this when we're having difficulty deciding. Maybe it's, what should our organization be doing going forward, or, what should we be doing with their time off work? We might see that we're cycling or going around and around. We don't see we're getting anywhere, or we're actually noticing that it's become polarized. Maybe it's not super emotional, but we're become kind of stuck in our views. Should we spend the money on the office remodel? Should we go to gender neutral bathrooms? Any number of issues that could be at play here. But in any event, it's about bringing all the issues affecting the decision to light, right? So that everyone can see them better. And again, going back to Mandelas' role theory, rather than the discussion happening between individuals with individual opinions, it's going to take place between roles. In this way, it enables people to say the unsayable. It allows them to sort of be less rigid in their view and feel less vulnerable saying something to the other person. And a key difference here is that the argument between two people from the argument between two people, the let's talk, is that here we're setting up the debate between two sides. Like again, side A and side B. Or you could say, again, between the two roles. So, should we merge? Should we not merge? Should we prioritize general neutral bathrooms amidst the budget cuts, or should we require attendance at virtual staff meeting when people live in the boonies without good connections? In every case, we set it up. We can see that there are different views or opinions, and we're going to look at the roles that exist, between individuals or with a group. Now, of course, you can do this sitting on a couch together, two people. You can do it at a conference table with more people. But an even better way to do it is to actually separate the two sides or the two roles physically in the room, and doing so while standing up. So you get out of your chair, you stand up. Anybody that has anything to say on side A, stand on this side of the room. Anybody that has anything to say on behalf of side B, stand on this side of the room. And you're speaking to each other. Again, there's no tennis in this model. One side goes and the other. There's no defense. So when you're setting it up and doing this, you don't want to make a big deal of it, especially if it's in a business setting. You might pause the conversation, say something like, "Hey, I noticed we're going around and around in circles or not making progress. Do you see this as well?" And if they do, you can just ask, like, if it's okay, we try something different. In a business setting, let's take a handbook, make sure everybody's in. And if you're facilitating, you want to ensure that people say everything they have to say first from one side and then the other. You repeat the process a couple times. If it goes on longer than this, there could be, there's something below the waterline that isn't being talked about, and you need to do something different or slow the process down. But here's a really cool idea. In this methodology, people are able to move from one side to the other. If they have a view, an opinion, or perspective to share on either side, which they very may well have, right? They're encouraged to share them. So we do it standing up so that participants have the ability to move freely and spontaneously. Humans find it difficult to not take sides, especially when they're only aware of a certain information. When they're not consciously aware of other things, they will easily take sides. And so we're encouraging them to have more fluidity of thought and movement. And so we have the conversation or the debate through roles rather than as individuals with personal opinions, and we allow them to move from side to side to encourage what we call role fluidity, right? So, at some point, you'll notice that in the conversation, some clarity might emerge, right? It could be that you just see that it's leaning a certain way. And if you sense that is strongly leaning one way, you can say to the group, it seems like we're ready to make a decision, right? It seems like what I'm hearing is this. Do you see this too? And people might say, yeah, we see that, Well, let's take a hand vote. Side A, who agrees with side A? If it's 70% or more majority, then you're probably ready to move forward. We're not shooting for consensus here necessarily. However, if you have less than 70% of the people in the room raise their hands saying they're in agreement with you, there's a good chance that there's still stuff that needs to be talked about. Maybe everything wasn't surfaced. People were not being specific enough. I'm just going to really gloss over this, but I spoke at a high level detail about how to do this in my webinar titled Making Decisions That Bring Us Along. I'll summarize the process here. So again, I noticed through that conversation that there tends to be a strong majority view in the room about side A. We should invest in the gender neutral bathrooms. Let's take a hand vote. You get 70% or more of the people in the room. Well, let's say if you get 70% or less than 70%, you might allow those individuals who did not put their hand up to maybe lobby for their opinion one more time, but you don't want it to let it go on too long because it'll frustrate and cycle the group. And then you could see if come back to the vote. You could do that a couple times. You could try the vote again. If you still don't have a majority, there's not asked. There's something below the waterline. Maybe it's the elephant in the room. I don't know. Maybe you're not asking the right questions. You need to try something else. But let's say you get to the 70% or more majority. What you do for each individual that still has their hand down, that didn't raise their hand, you go to them one at a time and say, something to the effect of, sorry, it didn't go your way. I'm sorry you lost the vote. We're going to go with, A, but we still want you to stay with us. What would it take for you to come along? Or what adjustment could we make that would work better for you? And it doesn't mean that they're going to get their way 100%, but you're seeing if there's something you can weave into your decision that'll maybe improve it. There's something in the minority view that could be of very great use to the decision. So you try that. You might get there, you might not, but you've at least tried, right? So we're trying to bring the wisdom from that minority view back to the decision, and then you vote again. You do that with each person. At the same time, the other thing, you're trying to just bring them along. You don't want them to sabotage the decision later. So you're doing your best to see if you can bring them along. But at some point, there's almost like a momentum, right? There's gravity. It's going this way, and you can't sit there and try to get to consensus in every decision. Obviously, especially at home, yes. At work, in groups, probably not. I get a little behind in my slides. I get so excited. And just very briefly, finally, in deep democracy, there's something called the argument between two groups. And here I'm referring to a situation where there may be a high level of differences or disagreement between two groups of people, and things have become polarized, probably. The issue is tense, and there's a high level of emotionality there. And to be honest, folks, this is a different level of complexity that requires very skilled professional facilitation. Issues of race and power and rank may well be present, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And again, I only mention this so that you'll know that the approach exists. Feel free to contact me if you'd like to explore it further, learn a little bit more about it. So in closing, I hope you see here that when views, that the view of conflict as something to lean into is the right one, and we don't want to avoid it, because when we do, it becomes an opportunity for us to gain some wisdom and become better versions of ourselves, to strengthen and deepen our relationships, to better understand ourselves, unleash our creativity, and better understand each other, improve our decision-making, all these things. But like anything, it requires some trying on. It's new. It may be uncomfortable to people at first, but that's life. I would say that if things are working for you, don't change them, right? If the structures and the way you're talking together, the way you're running your meetings at work are always working for you, and you're not getting into tensions and conflict, and they're not going unresolved, then don't do anything different. But if you are, I'm always going to encourage you to try something. Give it a try. See if you can build proof of success there. Practice it. I'm not saying that you're insane, of course not, but test it out for yourselves. You could start by having an argument with yourself. Like, let's say, do I want to buy a new car, or should I just hold tight for now and see what happens to the economy? Whatever that is, so you can separate it into two sides. You can get some practice with that debate with yourself. You could do something with a member of your family, or a friend or two. Then you could try it at work, right? Pick a topic again that's not conflictual, but one you can easily practice, and then do some reflection. What did I learn from this? What worked? What didn't? What would I try next? It does take a little fierceness, but we're fierce people when we want to be. And so thank you for being here, and thank you for caring.